The first I heard about this was a phone call from my agent saying, "I'm sending you to meet Pat O'Connor, who is the nicest man in the business, bar none." And so I went in with, full optimism and confidence. And he was right. I'm not sure the word nice is the one that Pat would select for himself, but he was a delight. Michelle Gish was there with him, the casting director, and these two people have remained great friends ever since. And I remember one of the first questions Pat asked me was addressing a concern about my age, because although I was 25, which is the age the character was written to be, he was a very worldly 25-year-old. This is a man who'd been through, Passchendaele and had suffered greatly, had been married, wife had left him, and I was probably rather unworldly, effete 25-year-old. And he said, "So, do you think you photograph older or younger?" And I said, "Well, I'm afraid, if I'm honest, I think I've been told I photograph younger than I am." And he said, "Well, that's irresistible honesty, isn't it?" And I think that's probably what got me the part. Was he's the kind of person where I think just likes a perverse, to take actions on a perverse instinct. So I think I got the call the next day or so. Pat just left a message, offered me the part. And from that moment on, I plunged into research about just about everything the film doesn't address directly. I think this is often quite a helpful thing to do. Whatever the film doesn't say, I should be thinking. So First World War. And it was quite a chastening experience. I realized that the way that war is documented is not only overwhelmingly powerful, to the extent that I think if anyone's going to do that reading, gird your loins. You tend to find there's an awful lot of World War II material. Despite the horrors of that war, a lot of it's adventure stories. There's a lot of spy stuff, there are adventure films. Very little of that on the First World War. The First World War is remembered through the words of poets, through diaries, letters, and very rarely without confronting the trauma of it. I think this film deals with the casualties in a way which is more oblique. There's a line that Kenneth Branagh's character has in it where he says, "I wonder if it's not perhaps worse for those of us who don't have anything to show for it," or something like that. The intact ones. He said, "I almost wish that I had an external," I'm paraphrasing now, "an external expression of what we went through, like a lost limb or two, blindness." No, I found that I found it a pretty intense experience. And then, of course, there was the man's actual job, which was the restoration of these paintings. And it's quite thin on the ground. I mean, trying to find people who specialize in that. It's an extraordinary craft. And I went down to Winchester Cathedral where someone was actually doing that work and was shown what it takes, and got a glimpse of the mystery of it all and the precision that's required. It is quite extraordinary. I read the novel many times. It's a short novel. It's a joy to read. I mean, you could read it over and over again just for the pleasure of the prose. I think J.L. Carr is a mysteriously underappreciated writer. I think he's as good a writer as any of his generation in England. And this felt to me, it had almost the qualities of perhaps a Chekhov's story or something. He's not a florid writer. He's not a sentimental writer. That was really my way in more than anything else. It was the first time that I'd read anything at that age where I'd been called upon to play a person with a past. I think being a callow 20-year-old, you're likely to get the roles of fairly wide-eyed young boys in love, or where you're concerns are either the immediate present or the future. And to, at the age of 25, to play someone who's haunted by something that had happened already in his adult life was not only the first time for me, but it's probably the last time for many more years. It's the sort of thing that I'm lucky enough to get now. It's one of the few things that mitigates getting older. And but that was it was quite a challenge, but it was also, it felt like a real gift, something very unusual. And the book was what helped me with that. There's a toughness to it. The character has no self-pity whatsoever. The way he reacts to, he has this rather phlegmatic response to just about all his woes, really. The line about his wife, she's saying she wants to get back together, she usually does, and only really hinting at what he'd been through in the war, which I think is very truthful to veterans of an experience like that. And a kind of, I would say, superficial disdain for strangers. You realise that he develops a love for these people, but I remember lines in it like, well, what's the point of meeting a new person? We meet, we go our separate ways, go away. Doesn't matter, I don't want to know you. And I felt very equipped with all of that as well, because I think that allows the film's tenderness, because ultimately it's an extremely humane story. It allows it to have some authenticity. And his clear love of Yorkshire, of his own environment. I met Jim Carr. He came to the set and spent some time with us. And nothing surprised me, having just described his writing. He had a sort of rather bluff Yorkshire reserve, but very much with a twinkle and a lot of warmth if you spent a bit of time with him. And he was, I remember he said he was, I don't think anyone had adapted his work before for film. And he was delighted that we were doing it, and he was extremely supportive of me when he met me doing the role, which gave me an immense amount of confidence. I don't think I'd ever met the writer of a novel that, of which I was doing an adaptation. I'm trying to think if I've even met a writer of a novel. No, so he was incredibly supportive. He was bewildered by how pared down it all was. He said he felt that one of his great strengths as a writer was dialogue, and he's absolutely right. I mean, you could probably have lifted the book and put it on the page and spoken all the words and still had a lovely film. But that's not how film adaptation works, and Pat had a very, I think, a very, very clear idea of the other kinds of language that you need to draw on to make a film. Obviously, it was quite a pedigree because we had Simon Gray adapting it for us, and he and Pat worked very closely together. And there had been a version, I think the first version I read featured a voiceover. It's sometimes an almost irresistible temptation when your source material is so good to just use all of it. But you do have to leave space for other things to happen, which aren't just to do with words. And Jim was not complaining, he just was lamenting that some of the nuggets had gone. I think there was a lot of talk about what should be put back in and what shouldn't, perhaps. I can't remember the details of those now. In fact, it's a bit of a lesson when you're doing this job to realise that the arguments that seemed so important at the time when you were in the workshop, so to speak, get forgotten. When you're happy with the end result, everyone forgets what seemed so critical. It is 30 years later, so I'd be unlikely to remember them anyway. But I do remember there were discussions, and I remember there's that you tend to encounter a director who's been through it for months and has had all the same thoughts and has had to be austere about it and just say, don't go back there. We've had, you know, this has come and gone endlessly. And I do think you just have to make a very, very tough decision sometimes. A beautiful line does not necessarily make a beautiful scene or a better film. Jim gave me a little bit of background on who Alice Keach had been in his own life. Obviously, he had not been through the First World War, but I think the romantic element of it was very, very personal to him. And he said, she's real, and she knows who she is. She's read the book, and she knows that I mean her, but it had always been unspoken between them. So all of that gives you a little bit of magic and resonance when you're doing it. There was a great deal of discussion about the title of the film. When I first read the script, it was under the title of The Falling Man. That was a working title. I realized that it hadn't been settled upon, partly because J.L. Carr liked his title, the title of the book. And I disagreed, presumptuously disagreed with that being the right title for this particular exercise. The Falling Man appealed to me because I felt it had a darker edge. When the film was going to look rather sunny and beautiful, I thought it juxtaposed very well with the outward appearance of everything. And I think that's, to a very large extent, what the story is all about. You know, these people have to conduct themselves appropriately and completely and consistently with the world they've just been in. And it's not just the people who've been at war, it's the people who've been left behind. I think it's fractured everybody and everything. Alice Keach is married to a much older man because all the younger men are gone. That poor vicar, who we are encouraged to have a certain amount of antipathy towards when we watch the film, we realise that actually he's been made almost irrelevant because people's experiences are so traumatic, and people are so desperate that his functions are questioned. You know, he talks about, well, I'm just reduced to the orderly disposal of their dead and a few christenings and weddings, but I don't know what I can. I don't know what I can offer people anymore. And there are a few questions about that. You know, when I'm stuck up there in the belfry, listening to the sermon, saying, "Did you clothe the needy and feed the hungry?" Or so there's the man who seems to have been safely at home, but he's lost a great deal as well. Everybody's lonely, everybody's disconnected, nobody can really connect with each other in the way that they might need, because they're alone with this version of hell that they're in. And then you have the fresco, which is gradually being uncovered, revealing a medieval image of hell. And so everybody in it is a mystery to themselves and to each other. And in some ways, I think A Month in the Country has a kind of bittersweetness about it as a title. But I think The Falling Man perhaps helps point a little bit more squarely at the undercurrent. And I also think that there was a feeling at the time, in the mid-80s, where I think films were being a little bit polarised in the way they were being perceived. They were the kind of white flag, and I'd been a part of this. You know, I'm not a public school boy, but I got cast as one and been rather stuck with that for 20 years, 30 years. And I think that this film doesn't really quite belong in that camp of the white flannel public school boys suffering elegantly in the cricket pavilion. I think it's about something harsher than that. And I think titles can be quite important when it comes to that. There's also the problem of confusion with the Turgenev play. That doesn't have to be a problem for very long, but it did come up and still does come up over and over again. And I know this sounds like a prosaic objection, but the fact of it being a month, I think Pat felt was possibly misleading. He said it's quite important that this is several months over a long summer period, because people don't heal quite as quickly as that. It's for a month to even begin to get better, it might have risked seeming a bit facile, I suppose. But you know, like all the other things that I've talked about, I think in the end it fits, because that's what we ended up with. The church was in Buckinghamshire, a village called Radnage, which is as idyllic and beautiful as it looks. It is a Saxon church. Crossing my mind back, trying to square my limited knowledge of architectural history with 30 years of forgetfulness. Beautiful old church. The vicar of the church was incredibly welcoming and accommodating to us, and it's one of those happy occasions where the environment helps you do the job. Everybody, just about everybody, I think, gets a feeling when you walk into an old building like that, an old church like that. You know, it can be hot outside, and you walk in and suddenly it's the cool stone inside, and it's particular sort of smell of stone and plaster. And so, you know, all of that, I think, lent itself very much to our story. That church is, and the field next to it is like a sort of a character. We did manage to spend a few days in Yorkshire. The weather, as it tends to do to filmmakers, seemed to have a sense of irony. It was absolutely essential that the film was a summer, shot in summer. It was essential that we had that, balmy light and sense of heat, and partly as a healing effect, I suppose, but also, again, as a kind of juxtaposition with the darkness that everybody's feeling. Of course, it rained every day because it was England and it was August, and I think it was the rainiest August on record. I'm sure someone could go and check that, but I think it was the rainiest August in a long time, when we desperately needed sun. The problem that it created was such that an already very short shoot, again, I think 4 or 5 weeks, probably added up to 2 weeks of real time of filming, perhaps less. I mean, the amount of sunshine we had could be measured in minutes. We must have had some days when you had a clear hour of sunshine, but more often than not, I remember the director of photography, Ken Macmillan, looking up with his little eyepiece at the clouds and just saying, if you roll the camera now, you've got 40 seconds. And so a great deal of the film was shot in gaps in the clouds, and no take two. And sometimes you might hope that if you waited for an hour for another gap, you might get another go at that. So an awful lot of first take, just that's as good as we're going to get, and move on. The only bit of the film which needed rain was the opening of the film, when Birkin arrives in Oxgodby in the pouring rain, and we went up to Yorkshire to shoot that, and of course we got blazing sunshine. I won't spoil the film for those less observant people, but I'm sure you can see the limitations we had in making it look rainy when it wasn't. So basically, to an almost comical extent, the elements were against us. It's part of the job of an actor to see if you can understand experiences which you haven't had or couldn't possibly have. I mean, that's part of the job description. You have to use a feat of the imagination, and your level of success in the finished result is dependent on how successful you are at doing that. I mean, it's source material for a thing like that is very difficult. You might be able to spend a day shadowing a doctor if you're playing a doctor, spend a few hours in an office if you're playing an office worker. There are just some things that are a little bit beyond your scope. Even if I were able to go into a war zone and play a soldier, it's very unlikely that it would look like World War I. So all I really had was people's accounts. Difficult. And even if you manage to acquire all sorts of very secondary understanding, which can only be incredibly limited, I mean, you can't hope to have more than a clue. That doesn't mean you're going to be able to deliver anything meaningful. So, but once I realized the extent of the horror of that war, I mean, I'm not saying I understood the horror of it, but just the extent to which people had suffered and the numbers and the appalling futility. I was in danger of being somewhat paralyzed because I thought, well, I can't contain this stuff. I can't get to the bottom of it. And even if I can, I have no idea how I can convey anything. Which in some ways, I suppose, gives you a clue as to why a man who comes back from something like that doesn't try to convey anything. It'll be written on the physical damage to you, and all too often in the psychological damage. As we see, Kenneth Branagh's character Moon appears to be intact, and you realise he's suffered in a very specific way. You know, he's punished for his sexuality, even though he's a war hero. And Birkin has the twitch, the stammer, but neither of these men wear it on their sleeve or want to talk about it with anyone else. When Alice Keach asks him what his understanding of hell is, and they're talking about medieval hell in the painting, he shuts down immediately. And I just thought, well, I think I understand why he's shut down, even if I can't quite grasp much of the rest of it. So you just go where you can. You make an imaginative journey. You try to be as respectful of it as you can, and not try to impose ideas of your own which don't have any basis in real experience. And in some ways, I think the fact that the script was so mature in that respect, so restrained. I think from J.L. Carr through Simon Gray to Pat, all the way down to us, I think, you know, we thought, don't try to speak the unspoken. The stammer was very much scripted, and if I remember, they're written into the dialogue in the book. It's definitely J.L. Carr's idea, not Simon Gray's or mine or anybody else's. You know, Birkin's stammer and facial twitch, which I kept to quite a minimum. I didn't want that to look artificial or distracting, and so I did incorporate the twitch a couple of times very early on. I think there's something in the train where a hand goes up to the thing, you know, but it was so minimal it's probably lost on most people anyway. No, the stammer I think was quite important. I think that there's I think it was very interesting. Sort of sounds like a diversion, but I don't think it is. Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy, where she talks a lot about shell shock victims, the First World War, in the first book, in Regeneration. People at Craiglockett, you know, William Rivers, trying to find ways to treat them, and this assumption that shell shock victims were cowards or weak-minded in some way. And one of the things that's touched on is the idea that the form with which whatever hysterical symptom might take is perhaps a metaphor for the trauma. Some of the observations, if I remember, were things like hysterical paralysis of the legs, which was not uncommon, or complete loss of speech. According to the book, as I remember it, Rivers' idea is that your legs are paralyzed because you can't run. You're frightened, you want to run, but you can't. Like one of those nightmares where you can't scream. And I think something similar had occurred to me, perhaps. So this wasn't just as it wasn't just as facile as the idea that he's traumatized people develop a stammer. You know, I think there was something in his experience which meant that his ability to communicate had been compromised. And in the course of this story, that improves. And so it was important. So it wasn't just a random symptom of war. They were scripted. I can remember the ... dots, or however it was written in to the script. Whether I did them where I was told to do them or observed the script exactly, I don't know. There's some doubt about that. But no, they were definitely not an actor's embellishment. I think the film was appreciated at the time partly because it contrasted with the big slash and burn stuff. And not because people didn't want to see any more of that. I just think it was in the spirit of a varied diet as much as anything else. There's always been there's always been popcorn film. I love it as much as anybody. The action stuff. But I think that just occasionally to have something on offer which has a completely different language, a completely different pace, deals with things on an entirely different basis, I think was like a breath of fresh air. It was the kind of, what was it, the mid-80s, mid to late 80s. It was around the time, shortly after Tarkovsky had made Sacrifice. I think this was the sort of thing that was the idea of a slow, more internal, calmer film was associated with the Europeans, Polish cinema, that sort of thing. Vida's films, Bergman, and I think there were a number of filmmakers aspiring to access that sort of tone and sensibility to make films in English, and there was definitely an appetite for it. I think there still is. I've just produced one actually, which we shall see. It's just, in a similar way, is allowing very much people's inner life to speak rather than highly dramatic conflict or external events. But I do remember anecdotally, just from personal feedback at the time, saying I've been looking for a film like this for so long. I've been looking for something that's not in my face, that's not yanking me left and right, that's not ambushing me with sudden events. Because I think people can feel that their imagination has been exercised in a different way when they are allowed to meet the film halfway. I don't think there would be any other way to tell this story, to be honest. I think that it's about ideas and feelings which are hard to express, and therefore it cannot be demonstrative. And so if you're dealing with the interior life of people, probably a million ways of doing that, but I certainly think that you have to give the actors a chance to see what that looks like, to show people what that looks like. And Pat O'Connor was singularly sensitive to that. It's the thing that that excited him most. When people used to talk about seeing more of the landscape, he would talk about the landscape of a person's face, and he didn't want demonstration. He didn't want too much. He didn't want people giving it all away. I think he wanted to encourage a little bit of mystery, a bit of guesswork, and allow people to, look a bit more closely into someone's eyes to see what was going on. I was very conscious at the time that we were not being directed by an Englishman. I think that the kind of reserve we're talking about is obviously famously English, and Pat is not a reserved man. And I think that he did not look on the English from a sort of anthropological point of view, or with any of the rather glib assumptions and prejudices that go with any stereotype. He had an incredibly complex and very respectful and affectionate view of the English, with all the rather more critical angles that you might expect from an Irishman of his generation. That he really, really wanted to look at the heart of a community like that and to see what lay underneath all those distancing tactics that the English use. So it was, it felt almost more like an exercise of nurturing that aspect of Englishness and its conditions, and digging into what the most humane elements were, rather than making judgments or any sort of comedy of manners about, it's all too easy to kind of, to send up the stiffness of the vicar or the embarrassment of the courtship process. And he was also didn't fall into that trap, which I think the English do when they tell a story, a painful story, which is to hide behind irony, to hide behind a kind of, acerbic dismissal of things. And J.L. Carr's writing doesn't do that either. So I think we were quite blessed not to be in that world. I mean, irony is one of the great, is one of the major currencies of English language and English writing generally, and it's also, I think, language at its richest. So, I'm not making a great plea for earnestness in all cases. And I don't think he was being earnest, really. I just think he wasn't taking that route. It's only now, really, that I've come to realize just how long I've been doing this. And it's long enough to look back and wonder what's happened to films which I've done, which now could be considered old. And film can disappear. It can not only disappear from the cultural scene, it can physically disappear as well. And so I don't really know what the long-term life expectancy of a film is, unless it's a real classic. But I think an awful lot of little gems are an endangered species. And I haven't really asked the question of many of my, early body of work, perhaps with understandable reason, as to what their fate has been. But because this one is special to me, it has concerned me. Are there any prints? Who's got the negative? What transfers have been made? Will it ever be available to anyone? Will anyone ever care? And you don't ask that question 3 years later, 4 years later, and you're moving on to the next thing. But then you start to realize that among the things that you've done over several decades, 1 or 2 might just be precious and worth looking after. I don't know how completely it disappeared. I suppose it did completely disappear. I've got a VHS copy somewhere. It made it onto VHS. I do have a DVD somewhere, but that's some years old now. And because it wasn't a film of immense profile, I realized that, it could be at risk. In terms of it disappearing, I think most films do. I mean, if we're talking about a kind of cultural disappearance, most films do. There may be 1 or 2 a year that get remembered in one way or another, but it's more likely to be in an article than anybody seeing it on a big screen. You only have to, if you're very interested in trawling for old films, you only have to see how hard some of them are to get online. So, a film has to have its friends. It has to have something like the BFI, which I think is the salvation of an enormous number of otherwise, endangered films. Or it just has to have a, kind of support group or something. But sometimes it takes a generation to get curious about what happened, where these things are. And by that time, the chances are it's too late. So this one does seem to have been whisked from the jaws of oblivion in the nick of time. It's important to me, not just because for a long time I felt it was the best thing I'd ever been involved with. Perhaps I still do feel that. But also the nature of the personal friendships that came out of it. Pat O'Connor remains one of my closest friends. He's still one of the directors I admire most in the world. One of the reasons I was excited to meet him was because the two films I'd already seen of his I loved. My first trip to Cannes, I'd just done a film called Another Country, and it was there at the same time as his film Cal. And I loved it. I was envious. I wanted to be in that film. And Ballroom of Romance, I think, is as good a film as you'll see, period. I think it's an absolute perfect little masterpiece. But that's where I formed a friendship with Kenneth Branagh and with Natasha. And a great many of the other people as well on that film. I think when there's a certain magic to the process, when you feel like you're making something worthwhile, even in a bit of adversity, that really stays with you. I don't know if it made much impact on a professional level. It's rather hard to measure those things. It obviously wasn't a spectacular enough success to transform my life overnight. I was surprised, I think, by how much love it did get, not because I was pessimistic about it, but just because I felt we'd done something too small and intimate to get noticed. So I felt that I'm very gratified by the extent to which it did. I'd done 2 or 3 films up to that point. I hadn't really noticed that I hadn't played a lead in a film. I suppose, a leading role, but I suppose the idea that, that this time you're the protagonist. This might have been the first one. But then, of course, Kenneth Branagh was already a legend. And so I rather felt it was his. Oh, he was cast first too, by the way. So it was Pat O'Connor with Kenneth Branagh attached. So I think I rather felt like I just was tagging along. But it was, it might have been the first thing I did on film, which I felt, at least on a personal level, was as much mine as anybody else's. That I wasn't just a cog in the machine. That there was that rather proud sense of being at least a shareholder in the process.